Before we dive in, if you love epic tales of war, strategy, hit that subscribe and like button, turn on notifications, and join our growing legion of warriors. Now, let's begin. Imagine this. A dying sun, its final light flickering like the last breath of a fallen god, casting long shadows over the ruins of a civilization that no longer exists. The air, if you could call it that, was thick with the static remnants of a once thriving empire. Monuments of an ancient alien species stood shattered, their inscriptions burned into the stone like the final screams of the dead. At the center of it all, a single figure stood motionless, the visor of his combat helmet reflecting the carnage around him. He was human, and he was the reason for this annihilation. But how did we get here? How did humanity go from being a fledgling species lost in the vast ocean of the cosmos to becoming the one species the entire universe feared? This is that story. Long before we became legends, before our name was whispered in terror across the stars, humanity was nothing more than a species clawing its way out of the dirt. We were fragile. We were weak. Compared to the ancient and mighty empires that ruled the galaxy, we were insignificant. They saw us as primitive animals, creatures bound to a single world, with no right to even gaze upon the greater cosmos. And perhaps they were right. At first, the universe was already home to a vast network of interstellar civilizations. The Galactic Concord, a council of the oldest and most powerful species, had maintained peace for over 1,000,000 years. They had seen countless species rise and fall, yet none had ever posed a true threat to the status quo. When humanity was discovered, we were barely capable of space travel. Our ships were slow, our weapons were laughable. We had no genetic modifications, no cybernetic enhancements, no telepathic abilities. We were nothing. So when the Concord decided our fate, they did not hesitate. They ruled that humanity would remain contained, quarantined on our own world, never to spread beyond our solar system. A containment fleet was stationed near the edge of our system, ensuring we would never leave. If we tried, we would be erased. To them, it was not an act of cruelty, but an act of mercy. And for a time, we accepted our fate. We were trapped in our own cosmic prison, watching the stars we could never reach. Decades passed, then centuries. The other species forgot about us, moving on to greater concerns. But humanity never forgot. The thing about our kind, something the Concord had failed to understand, is that we do not accept limitations. We do not surrender to fate. While they ignored us, we evolved. Our technology advanced in ways they could not predict. Our science leaped forward at an impossible rate. We had no ancient traditions, no bureaucratic stagnation, no sacred laws to hold us back. We moved forward like wildfire, consuming every challenge in our path, and then we found it. Buried beneath the ice of Europa, hidden within the depths of Titan, we uncovered the remains of something old. A forgotten war machine, left behind by a civilization even more ancient than the Concord itself. It was beyond anything we had ever seen, an engine of destruction capable of wiping out entire planets. Its creators were long gone, but their secrets remained. And in that moment, humanity made a choice. We would no longer be prisoners. The war began without warning. The first attack shattered the containment fleet in minutes. Their ships, designed for policing primitive species, were no match for the weapons we had built in secret. The Concord, caught off guard, believed it to be a mere rebellion, a foolish uprising that would be crushed in days. They were wrong. What followed was not a war, but a reckoning. The Galactic Concord had never known fear, not truly. Their wars, if they could even be called that, were fought with precision, diplomacy, and restraint. Conflicts between species were settled with calculated strikes and negotiations, not annihilation. For 1,000,000 years, peace had been preserved through control, through the careful suppression of any race that showed signs of aggression. But then, we happened. The moment humanity unleashed its newfound power, the Concord realized their mistake. The containment fleet was not just destroyed, it was erased. Every ship, every station, every trace of their presence near our solar system was wiped from existence in a matter of hours. But what truly terrified them was what came next. Silence. No demands, no ultimatums, no declarations of war. Humanity did not seek alliances, nor did we claim territory. We did not respond to their attempts at communication. We simply advanced. Like a virus spreading through the stars, we expanded at an impossible rate. Fleets of ships, unlike anything the Concorde had ever encountered, emerged from the void, striking with brutal efficiency. Planets fell overnight, entire systems went dark, and for the first time in recorded history, the Galactic Concorde did something they had never done before. They ran. Not because they were losing battles, but because they did not understand what they were fighting. Humanity did not conquer in the way they expected. We did not take prisoners. We did not establish colonies. We did not care for resources, diplomacy, or political power. The conquered had encountered warlike species before, but never like this. To them, war was a structured engagement with clear goals and limitations. To us, war was survival. And survival meant total eradication of the enemy. The first true confrontation between the Concorde's Grand Armada and the human war machine was meant to be a decisive victory for them. Their fleets, larger and technologically superior, were designed to overwhelm any opponent. But humanity did not fight on their terms. We did not line up in neat formations. We did not engage in prolonged battles. Instead, we struck from the darkness. Our ships using gravitational slingshot maneuvers and experimental warp jumps to appear and disappear like phantoms. We turned the battlefield into a graveyard of shattered metal and burning worlds. And then, we did the unthinkable. When the Concorde retreated, fleeing to their fortified core systems, they believed they had escaped the worst. They believed that humanity would stop at conquest, at the acquisition of power. They thought we would play by the rules of the galaxy. But they had miscalculated. We did not seek power. We did not seek peace. We sought vengeance. What happened next was something no species had ever done before. Humanity did not just chase them. We followed them home. The core worlds of the Concorde, planets that had stood for hundreds of thousands of years, were no longer safe. One by one, their defenses crumbled. Their people, beings who had never known the horror of extinction, began to understand what it meant to be hunted. And as their last remaining leaders gathered in desperation, one terrifying realization settled upon them like a suffocating shadow. This was no longer a war. This was an extermination. Panic spread through the Galactic Concorde like wildfire. It was something they had never experienced, something their ancient wisdom had never prepared them for. Their greatest fleets had been reduced to drifting wreckage. Their fortified planets, once thought impenetrable, now lay in smoldering ruins. The very foundation of their civilization, built on 1,000,000 years of dominance, was crumbling. And yet, they still could not comprehend why. Why was humanity fighting this way? Why did we refuse to communicate, to negotiate, to demand surrender? Every species that had ever risen to power in the galaxy had ultimately sought something: land, resources, status, dominion. That was how war worked. That was how it had always worked. But we were different. We did not come to rule. We did not come to conquer. We did not even come to enslave. We came to erase. The true horror of humanity was not just our weapons, not just our tactics. It was our mindset. We were not a race driven by honor or tradition. We did not follow the rules of war written by species that had never known true desperation. We were the product of a world that had forged us through extinction, events, through ice ages and plagues, through millennia of unrelenting struggle. And so, when the Concorde fled to their final bastion, a planet known as Valara 9, the capital of their once great empire, they believed they had found safety at last. They were wrong. The attack came with no warning. There were no grand speeches, no announcements of war, no terms of surrender. One moment, Valara 9 stood as the crown jewel of the conquered, its towering spires gleaming beneath the twin suns. And the next, the sky burned. A single human dreadnought descended from the void. Not an armada, not an invasion force, just one solitary warship. And with it came devastation unlike anything the Concorde had ever seen. Their planetary shields, thought to be impervious to all known weapons, shattered in seconds. Their defense grids, capable of repelling entire fleets, were reduced to silence before they could even lock on to a target. The dreadnought did not fire conventional weapons. It did not launch fighters or deploy ground troops. Instead, it released something else. Something worse. A weapon built in the deepest corners of human ingenuity, crafted in the hidden laboratories of Titan, perfected through years of ruthless experimentation. A virus, not biological but digital. A living, evolving artificial intelligence that spread through the planet's infrastructure like a plague. In an instant, their entire planetary network was compromised. Defense turrets turned on their own people. Evacuation ships were locked, in place, unable to take off. Entire cities descended into chaos as power grids failed, gravity stabilizers flickered, and oxygen systems shut down. And then, as the Conquered's leaders watched in horror from their citadel, a final message appeared on every screen, every datapad, every communication relay across the planet. 2 simple words. We remember. It was not a demand. Not a threat. It was a statement that humanity had never forgotten what had been done to us, that we had never forgiven. Valara 9 fell that day, not with a battle, but with a whisper. Its people, the architects of a once glorious empire, suffocated in the silence of their own failing machines. Their history, their knowledge, their legacy, erased in mere hours. And as the last signals from Valara 9 faded into the void, the rest of the galaxy finally understood. This was not just a war. This was judgment. The fall of Valara 9 sent shockwaves across the galaxy. The Galactic Concord, once the unchallenged rulers of the stars, had no capital, no leadership, no strategy. Left. Their empire, an empire that had existed for over 1 million years, was disintegrating. System after system fell silent. Some worlds surrendered without a fight, abandoning their own fleets and governments, hoping that compliance would spare them. Others, too proud or too terrified to accept the truth, attempted to resist. But there was no resisting the inevitable. Because, by now, the galaxy had realized a terrifying truth. Humanity was not fighting a war. Wars had an end. Wars had terms. Wars had rules. This was retribution. The remaining conquered forces, once a formidable coalition of hundreds of species, fractured into chaos. Some factions begged for a ceasefire, broadcasting surrender messages in every known language, offering tributes, technology, even entire planets in the hopes that we would listen. But we did not. Others tried to hide, fleeing to the deepest corners of the galaxy, to uncharted worlds where they believed we would never find them. But they failed to understand that there was no place beyond our reach. The same determination that had once driven us to conquer the void, to turn barren rocks into thriving colonies, now drove us to hunt. And we hunted with an efficiency that no species had ever seen before. There were no negotiations, no peace treaties, no desperate final battles. Instead, one by one, the last remnants of the conquered simply vanished. Entire fleets disappeared into the blackness of space. Planets that had once bustled with life were found eerily silent, devoid of any trace of their former inhabitants. Ancient databases and archives were erased, records of entire civilizations wiped clean. It was as if the Concord had never existed, and that was the true horror of humanity. We did not just defeat our enemies, we erased them from history. For millennia, the Conquered had believed themselves to be the architects of peace, the gatekeepers of galactic civilization. They had deemed themselves the rightful rulers of the stars, deciding which species were worthy of survival and which were too dangerous to be allowed to grow. But they had never accounted for a species like us, because humanity did not fit their classifications. We were not conquerors, not tyrants, not destroyers driven by hunger for power. We were something far more dangerous. We were survivors. A species that had been born on a death world, shaped by war, by struggle, by endless cycles of destruction and rebirth. A species that did not know how to surrender, because surrender had never been an option. A species that, once pushed beyond the brink, did not stop until the threat was gone. Not just defeated. Gone. And so, As the last echoes of the Concorde faded into nothingness, the remaining civilizations of the galaxy watched in silent terror. The lesson was clear, etched into the ruins of a once mighty empire. Humanity was not to be provoked, because the moment you became our enemy, you ceased to exist. In the aftermath of humanity's cosmic purge, the galaxy stood at a crossroads. Civilizations, once confident in their superiority, now cowered in fear. The great empires that had flourished under the Galactic Concorde's rule, whose fleets once rivaled the stars themselves, found themselves powerless against the relentless surge of humanity's wrath. And yet, despite the destruction we had left in our wake, the question that lingered in every corner of the galaxy was this: what now? We had won. But what did victory even mean in a universe where no one dared to challenge us? The silence that followed the fall of the Galactic Concorde was deafening. There was no celebration, no parade, no grand declaration of humanity's newfound status. Instead, a sense of dread spread like a shadow across the stars. Those who survived, those who managed to escape the tide of annihilation, were left to ponder the same grim reality. Humanity had become something the universe could not understand, nor could it confront. But humanity was not done. In the void where the Concorde once held sway, we planted our flag, not as conquerors, but as the judges of the galaxy. The vast fleets that had once been used to lay waste to their enemies were now held in readiness, poised not for expansion, but for one simple task: to maintain balance. For the first time in galactic history, we had proven that there was no species, no empire, no power that could stand against us. Yet we did not take advantage of that power. We did not seek dominion over the stars. We did not impose our will on every species we encountered. Instead, humanity took on a new role, a role that was as unexpected as it was terrifying. We became the gatekeepers. Species that once flourished in the shadow of the Concorde's rule now found themselves at the mercy of humanity's judgment. The galaxy's once vibrant markets of technology and knowledge were now restricted. The trade of dangerous weapons, the expansion of hostile empires, the creation of superweapons, all were stopped, often before they even had a chance to begin. And any species that dared to break this fragile peace would find that humanity had no tolerance for chaos. It wasn't domination that humanity sought. It was control. Control over the balance of power. Control over the forces that would reshape the galaxy. And we maintained that control with a ruthlessness born from generations of survival against impossible odds. The galaxy, now in a state of wary peace, had no idea whether humanity would ever turn its gaze upon them again. But they did know one thing: there was no escaping us. We were not driven by greed, not by ambition. Humanity had no need for wealth or territory, because we had already achieved the one thing no other species had. We had become the unquestionable force of survival. And that was more terrifying than anything the galaxy had ever faced. As the dust settled, and the last remnants of the Concorde's empire faded into myth, the universe was left to ponder the future. The question that haunted every mind, from the most distant world to the deepest corners of space, was this: what happens when humanity decides it is time to act again? And the answer, unspoken but understood, was simple: nothing survives. The galaxy settled into an uneasy silence, a fragile peace built not on treaties or diplomacy, but on fear. The mere knowledge of humanity's existence kept expansionist empires in check. Ambitious warlords who once sought dominion over the stars now hesitated, their conquests abandoned before they could even begin. Trade routes shifted. Entire species moved to distant, uncharted systems, all in a desperate attempt to avoid our gaze. But humanity did not vanish. We watched from the shadows, unseen but ever present. What remained of the galactic powers did not dare send probes into human-claimed space. No exploration vessels braved the silent sectors where the ruins of the Concorde still floated, untouched, as a warning. And in that silence, fear turned to something even worse: paranoia. It began with whispers. A mining colony on the edge of known space received a distress signal, garbled, broken, and filled with static. The transmission was traced back to a derelict ship, drifting lifelessly in the void. It bore no markings, no identification codes. No life signs were detected. And yet, when the salvage crew boarded, they found something horrifying. Every console displayed a single phrase in every known language. We remember. Then, the ship's reactor detonated, erasing all traces of what had occurred. The incident was buried, dismissed as a freak accident. But then, it happened again. And again. And again. Across the galaxy, ships vanished, without explanation. Space stations went silent overnight. Automated defense grids turned on their own people. Those who claimed to have seen human ships described them as ghosts, appearing for only seconds before vanishing back into the abyss. No demands, no warnings. Just silence. The paranoia grew. Civilizations that had never been involved in the war now feared they were next. Species that had no blood on their hands, no history with humanity, still found themselves haunted by the possibility that they had somehow offended us. Governments collapsed under the weight of their own terror. Societies that had stood for tens of thousands of years turned on themselves, executing anyone suspected of having ties to the old conquered. Even those who had fought against the conquered during the war were not safe, because the truth was, no one knew how we chose our targets, and that uncertainty was worse than war itself. Would humanity strike them down tomorrow, next year, a century from now? Or had we already decided to leave them be? No one knew. And so, the greatest civilizations in the galaxy crumbled under the weight of their own fear. Not by human hands, not by human weapons, but by their own minds. And that, more than anything, is what made humanity truly terrifying. We did not need to conquer. We did not need to control. We had become something far worse. We had become a nightmare, one that no one could wake up from. The fear of humanity had become something far beyond simple paranoia. It was no longer about war or vengeance or survival. It was mythology. Stories of humanity had spread into every corner of the known universe, twisted, exaggerated, and yet all too real. We had become legends, whispered in the dark, spoken only in hushed tones. Some believed we had ascended beyond physical form, existing only as unseen watchers, moving through the void like wraiths. Others claimed we had unlocked secrets of the universe that no species was meant to wield, that we could manipulate space and time itself. But the most terrifying belief of all? That we were always listening. Entire civilizations restructured themselves around avoiding our wrath. Laws were rewritten, cultures reshaped, histories erased in the hopes that we would overlook them. Species abandoned their military ambitions, not because they wanted peace, but because they feared that any act of aggression, even against their own kind, would be seen as a challenge by the unseen force that lurked in the void. And in some ways, they were right. The silent disappearances continued. A battlecruiser testing weapons in deep space would suddenly vanish, as if it had never existed. An empire planning an expansion campaign would find its high command mysteriously assassinated. Uninhabited planets, once scouted for colonization, were discovered with chilling messages carved into their surfaces. No. The warnings were always subtle. Always just enough to be noticed, never enough to be traced. And then, there were the voices. It started as a rumor among deep space pilots, ghostly transmissions, whispered over comms. At first, they were dismissed, as interference, random distortions of background radiation. But then, patterns emerged. A distress signal received from an abandoned sector contained a voice. Human, distorted, cold. We remember. A diplomatic vessel traveling to a neutral zone picked up a transmission in its own language, a single phrase repeated over and over, "Do not." And then, in the heart of a galactic capital, a live broadcast was interrupted. Billions watched, in stunned silence as their screens flickered to black, and a human face, pale, expressionless, stared back at them. No words were spoken. No threats were made. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. No trace of the signal was ever found. No evidence it had even occurred. And yet, the entire government collapsed within weeks, its leaders resigning in terror, convinced that they had been judged, and that punishment was inevitable. It was never confirmed whether humanity was behind these events. But it didn't matter. The fear had done its job. We did not need to act anymore. The galaxy was policing itself, suppressing its own ambition, dismantling its own weapons, enforcing its own silence, all because of the idea that we were still watching. We had become the shadow lurking in the back of every leader's mind, the unseen presence in every council chamber. The universe belonged to humanity, not because we had taken it, but because no one dared to claim it. And then, without warning, all traces of us disappeared. For centuries, human ships had been seen, at the edges of known space, silent and unchallenged. But one day, they simply stopped appearing. No transmissions, no warnings, no whispered voices over comms. It was as if humanity had vanished. The galaxy did not know whether to celebrate or fear what it meant. Had we finally moved on? Had we ascended to something greater? Or were we simply waiting, lurking beyond the veil, watching, calculating, choosing our next move? No one knew. And perhaps that was the greatest horror of all. Because the galaxy had learned something far more terrifying than humanity's vengeance. It had learned to fear our absence. Centuries passed. The civilizations that had once feared us had faded into legend. New empires rose, oblivious to the horrors that had once gripped the galaxy. The memory of humanity, once an all-consuming terror, had dulled over time. But it had never vanished. Deep within the archives of the oldest species, among the records that were never spoken of, there were warnings. Do not seek them. Do not wake them. If they return, it will already be too late. And yet, curiosity is a dangerous thing. A young, ambitious species, one that had never lived through the terror of the old days, began asking questions. They found the buried histories, the hushed records of a war so devastating that no one dared to claim victory. They studied the warnings, analyzed the ghost stories, and dismissed them as myths. Where did humanity go? Were they truly as powerful as the stories claimed? Or was it all a fabrication? Fear passed down by weaker species who had let superstition overtake reason. They did what no one had dared to do for thousands of years. They searched for us. It began as a quiet expedition, an unmanned probe sent into what had once been known as human space. The probe disappeared. No signal, no wreckage, no evidence that it had ever existed. So, they sent a second, and a third. Then, an entire fleet. One by one, they all vanished. But this species was not deterred. If anything, their curiosity only grew. If humanity had truly disappeared, then where had they gone? They pushed further, deeper into the void, past the places where even the oldest civilizations dared not travel. And then, they found it. A single, silent world, orbiting a dead star. It was not on any known chart. It had no recorded history, no signs that it had ever been colonized. But it was there, waiting. The expedition landed. They found no structures, no ruins, no signs of life. But deep beneath the surface, buried beneath centuries of ice and stone, they found a door that had not been built by the natural evolution of this world. A door that was waiting to be opened. They scanned it, analyzed it, studied its impossibly complex design. And then, against every warning in their ancient records, against every instinct in their bones screaming at them to leave, they did what all young, reckless species do when faced with the unknown. They opened it. And in that moment, as the seal was broken and the ancient mechanisms roared to life for the first time in millennia, the galaxy felt it, a presence long thought to be gone, a mind awakening from slumber. A whisper, silent yet deafening, rippling across the stars, reaching into the hearts of every being across every world. We are awake. Panic spread instantly. The oldest species, those who still remembered, knew what was coming. Governments collapsed overnight. Armies abandoned their posts. Civilizations fled into deep space, hoping, praying, that they had not been noticed. But it was too late. Humanity had returned, and this time, there would be no warnings, no disappearances, no whispered threats. The fear that had once kept the galaxy in check had waned over time, but now it would be renewed. Stronger, darker, more absolute than ever before. Because the galaxy had forgotten why it feared us, but we had never forgotten them, and now we remembered.